Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, depending on your time zone. Thank you so much for joining us today for a fantastic dev camp each month on a Thursday with the amazing Ted Patterson, Principal Program Manager here with our Power BI CAT team, which is the Customer Advisory team. Ted, good morning. How are you? Well, it's good afternoon for you, isn't it, over there on the East Coast, right?
It is afternoon here, 2 p.m.
Awesome. And what are we going to discuss today? AppOwnsData Starter Kit, right?
We are going to look in a very developer-centric part of Power BI, not using it as a SaaS service, a software as a service, but using it as platform as a service. So using Power BI as the thing in the back room that makes your wonderful custom application shine.
That's fantastic news. Well, it is 11:02 p.m. And with that, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And on with the AppOwnsData Starter Kit. Thanks, Ted. Thanks also, Daniel, our producer.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. Thanks, everyone, for joining. Thanks, everyone who's going to watch the video after we present it. As usual, I just want to have a slide about the Power BI Dev Camp portal. One thing that's kind of nice about the portal is we have various links here. If you come back later and watch the video, you go to the portal page, we have the links to all the different resources. If you're here live with us, you're going to get those links right in the chat window as well. Also, what I'm going to cover is a fairly large developer sample. And so all the code and all the documentation is available in this GitHub repository. So as I go through and I open up things in Visual Studio and run them, all that code is accessible to you. And our hope is that many, ISVs and large enterprise organizations, could use this as kind of the starting point for their proof of concept application. Get something up, get it running, and start kind of seeing it work in your hands. One thing that happened is we put together a bunch of documentation. So one of the things that's kind of nice is I have a lot of resources to give you afterwards for the people that want to drill into the nuts and bolts. Quite often I worry a lot about making sure you get enough. But here we can kind of stay more at a high level because those that want to go through and open the thing in Visual Studio and go to Azure Active Directory and create the application and make sure it all stands up, we've got the detail, here in this documentation. And also, I created a 6-part video series that kind of has very detailed step-by-step walkthroughs. You're going to see some links, in the chat window right now. You can just go to the videos link at the Microsoft YouTube channel. And I just want to call out to both Kelly and Daniel. Thanks so much for getting these published. And once again, for those of you who want to get this thing up and running, the detail is there, and I don't have to worry so much about hurrying through and covering kind of the low-level stuff during this session today. So with that, what we're going to talk about with the AppOwnsData Starter Kit is, first of all, let's examine the solution architecture. And then there's 2 different applications. If your company is going to be taking on, AppOwnsData embedding with Power BI, we need an application for our own internal users to administrate the environment. And then also, we want an application for our customers, for the ultimate end user. So we're going to have sections where we look at each of these applications. And at the very end, we're going to look at, how to add a, facility into your code so you can start monitoring user activity and the performance of your reports. How long do they take to load? How long do they take to render? Okay, sounds good. Now, let's kind of start with this idea of you decide to embrace Power BI, as a PaaS, a platform as a service entity. And the idea is that you have lots of customers and you have a Azure AD tenant where you're running Power BI. But what you'd like to do is you'd like to create a little footprint, for each customer by creating a Power BI workspace. And we're going to call this a tenant. So this is what we call multi-tenant work with Power BI. Now, of course, there's the confusion of what do you mean by tenant? Is it the thing for the customer, just a workspace? Or is it the whole Azure AD tenant? So just at a high level, within a single Azure AD tenant, which is typically owned by the company that, is offering the application to their customers, within that single Azure AD tenant, we're going to create these little pockets. which are we're going to call customer tenants. And in the simplest case, which is what we're going to do here, each of your customers is going to get a Power BI workspace, with one or more data sets, one or more reports, and we have to manage this environment. Now, you might have gone through and done this by hand, in the Power BI service, just using the user interface they provide, maybe the admin portal, but what you're going to find is it doesn't scale. So if you're taking on a couple customers a week and then it gets to 10 or 100 customers a week, we have to find some way to automate this process of creating a workspace and basically uploading a PBIX file to create the data set and reports and working with the data source credentials, so that we can connect the data set, to some particular database. And if we have a case where it's not just one, but it's 1, 2, and however many customers that you have, you want some type of onboarding process that's going to allow you to have a database template that you can upload and simply point to whatever particular customer, database connection string you need, for that tenant. Okay, so this is one of the, the objectives of what we want to look at today. Now, with AppOwnsData embedding, one of the great things that companies like about AppOwnsData embedding and the PaaS aspects of Power BI is that you don't have to bother with making sure users are licensed with Power BI. In fact, Power BI doesn't know anything about your users. And so one of the things to see, if Power BI doesn't know about your users, it can't differentiate one from another. So when it comes to authorization, basically you're somewhat on your own. Now, let's say you have this issue where you're embedding some content and everybody that can see it sees the exact same thing. Well, that's a rare circumstance, but it could be a case where Power BI embedding is simple because you don't have to really differentiate between your users. But more often than not, your application, one of its core responsibilities is to differentiate between different groups of users and give some users access to some content, other users access to other content. Once a user gets access to the content, should that user then have permissions to edit or create new content, within that tenant? So we have to kind of get our business requirements together. And what we're going to see is when people develop with AppOwnsData embedding, one of the key observations is you have the flexibility to design an authorization scheme any way you'd like. But along the exact same lines, you also have this responsibility to build some type of an authorization scheme, from the ground up. Power BI can't help you if it doesn't know who your users are. And one of the things that we see is that when people start working with AppOwnsData, it's not always intuitive to create a custom database. And while not every single customer who's been successful, has created their own custom databases, once you do, you're just going to get a lot more traction, into solving the problems that you need. So with the AppOwnsData Starter Kit, what do we like to provide guidance for? As we wrote this and documented it, so onboarding new customer tenants, certainly that's one of the big takeaways that you're going to get by following this guidance and getting up to speed on this app. Managing user permissions. How do we store a user profile that says what permissions this user has, versus the permissions of another user? Also, we want to implement the end user facing application as a single page application because that's the modern trend. We want broad reach, but also we're going to introduce a custom telemetry layer. And that is, since we're creating this whole application ourselves, when something interesting happens in the client application, maybe the user views a report, the user doesn't edit and saves, the user creates a new report, we want to monitor that user activity. So this starter kit is going to kind of give you a starting point for a custom telemetry layer, where you're able to just go to a custom database and view, who's looked at what, who's done editing, who's done creating. And then also, as we'll see, by the time we get to the end, when we create our own custom telemetry layer, you can also start monitoring the performance of reports because you can capture how long it took each report to basically load and then how long it took after that to render. Okay, now let's look at the solution architecture. So basically, we're going to have two applications. The admin owns data application is the one that is used by the company's internal users who administrate the environment. And so as they create new tenants, that application has to talk to the Power BI REST API. And also, as it does things like creates a new workspace, we're going to start keeping a profile for each tenant in our own custom database. It's just going to make it so we don't have to do lookups back to Power BI. And one of the nice things that you can do to decrease the number of round trips, is basically put the answers to the questions that you need into a database that's faster to look up. Also, you have the AppOwnsData client application. And because we want to create that, with a very lightweight SPA architecture, we're going to put this entry point, which is the AppOwnsDataWebApi. So both the API and the admin application talk to the Power BI REST API, and they both read and write from the underlying AppOwnsData database as well. Okay, now, when we created the database schema for this, we started with, let's create a table for tenants. Every time we create a new workspace and we assume that's a customer tenant, we'll put a record into the tenants database. Also, whenever a user logs in, we're going to have that login ID. And so we'll record that user, but then we can create an activity log, so everything the user does, we're able to put an entry into the activity log that points back to that user. Now, we, in no means think that this is a thorough schema for, many scenarios. What we wanted to do is, create a simple schema to give you a starting point. And if I take 3 different companies using AppOwnsData embedding, they're all going to need to extend it, but in different ways. So for instance, this model assumes that each user is associated with one tenant. So if you need something where you're going to have a user who can be assigned to multiple tenants, you probably need another table, a bridge table between tenants and users. This example is going to look a lot at security, but it doesn't get to row-level security. So if you wanted to add row-level security, you'd probably add a roles table and a user role assignments table. So once again, we're going to kind of start simple just so you can get an application up and going, and we expect that you would extend it. Now, the application itself is something that you can open in the latest versions of Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code. So everything is based on .NET 5 and ASP.NET Core. Also the libraries that we're using are the Power BI .NET SDK and some of the Microsoft authentication libraries that require .NET to kind of give us higher productivity. So what I would say to those of you who are using, Java, Node.js, Salesforce, at a high level, the application, will still, show you how to create the design, but because this is a .NET application, we can use productivity APIs. So we're not quite so, down in the trenches, creating HTTP requests and sending them across. But at a high level, the design of this, should be universal across, any platform you're using, whether it's .NET or not. Now, let's say, Daniel, this is our first pause. Do we have any questions yet?
So far, no questions in the
okay, well,
right now.
Daniel and I promised to stop and take questions when we get to the agenda, and no one has submitted questions yet. So we're going to have a couple times where we're going to stop. So if you have questions, as we go along, please drop them, into the Q&A window. Okay, well, let's go on now. So let's first of all talk about the AppOwnsDataAdmin application. So the idea is that this application is going to, act as a service principal. It's going to call to the Power BI REST API, and one of its core responsibilities is to do the onboarding, create the workspace, assign workspace to a capacity, upload PBIX file, and so on. And also note that the AppOwnsDataAdmin application, is also going to record every workspace it creates, by adding a record into the AppOwnsDataDB table. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of the details. That's why we have the documentation. That's why we have that video series. But kind of the long and short of it is once you install this, you have to go to Azure AD. You have to create a Azure AD application. You have to configure your tenant and Power BI tenant level settings to support service principal access. And then you're going to get things like the tenant ID, client ID, and client secret that you're going to take and add back into your project code. Now, the way that this tenant is going to work is that I'm going to basically say, I want to create a new tenant. And so it will bring up a form, and the user of this application is going to be able to put in a tenant name and details about where the database lives and just click create tenant. And when we do that, it's going to go through this onboarding process of calling to the Power BI REST API, and doing these operations. Now, what's the sequence? First of all, the code is going to create a new Power BI workspace. Now, in most scenarios, you would then assign a workspace to a dedicated capacity. I have that code commented out because I want you to be able to kind of create and get this thing running, whether you have a dedicated capacity or not. AppOwnsData embedding to use in a production environment, will require you to have your workspaces associated with a dedicated capacity, that is created via either an A SKU for Power BI embedded or a P SKU, for Power BI premium. But once again, while you're in the dev, environment, or while you're getting a POC up and running, you can just create a bland Office 365 trial, and you'll have everything you need to get this code up and running. Okay, that was a long dissertation. But after creating the workspace, the next thing we're going to do is import the PBIX template file, which is going to create the data set and our report. Well, then we have to update data set parameters because we want to redirect to a data source, which is the customer's database. So our template will allow us to point to any database, but then we have to run some code to actually do the redirect, for each particular customer. Now, once you've changed a database location, anything you change about the path or anything you change about, the type of connector means that you have to patch the data source credentials before you can do a refresh. And then after you patch the data source credentials, you can start a refresh operation. If you have an import data set. If you have a direct query data set, you don't start the refresh operation, but you have to patch the data source credentials, so it will connect properly. Now, once we've gone through this process, I should be able to jump over to Power BI and kind of see that workspaces are being created behind the scenes. As you get used to working with Power BI embedded, you're not going to need to go to Power BI because you'll just have confidence things were created properly. But as you're going through the discovery phase and you use this, basically create a tenant and then go to Power BI, and see what's been created. Now, what you're going to see is that everything as far as the workspace being created and the data set being created are going to be owned not by a user, but by the service principal. Okay. Now, a quick word about how this is going to work. Now, note that, let me move over for a second, to the application, and note down here, if I go into www root and I go into PBIX, there is a sales report template file. So the idea of this is that we've created a PBIX file that has two different data set parameters, which is database server and database name. And the idea is that then all your M code, will never have a hard-coded path to a database server or a hard-coded database name. Instead, you're going to take it off the parameters. And so this is what we do to create the PBIX file. And then at runtime, here's the code using the Power BI.NET SDK, that's able to get that PBIX file. We're able to publish it. And afterwards, we have a fairly simple approach, to be able to update those parameters. And once I update the parameters, the next thing we do, is we patch the data source. Now, another thing about the admin application is that it has a page to drill down on the tenant. And the idea of drilling down on the tenant is that your admin application might want to look at things or have the ability to upload extra PBIX files or manage data sets and data source credentials, things like that. Okay. Now, the other thing that I'm going to demo just now when I show the admin application is how to manage user permissions. And the idea is that as users use your application, you have complete control, over which tenant to assign a user to. And once you assign a user to a tenant, you can choose to give that user read-only permissions, or edit permissions, or edit plus create permissions. And we're going to see that in just a second. Okay. So users will have an edit button, that will allow us to get to the edit page, so we can assign them to a tenant, and we can basically modify that users can create property and can edit property. Okay, so demo time. So let's go back here, and what I'm going to do is, at first, I'm going to run the application through Visual Studio. And the reason I want to do this is that we can kind of look behind the scenes at Fiddler. So what I'm going to do here is, here's the application, and we can kind of see that if I log in to this application, and I realize that my login will be much easier if I go to a browser session that already has this login. Okay, so here I've logged in, and I'm going to go to Tenants. So basically, this is looking at the database and seeing what tenants I have. Note that the application, will also allow you to quickly, do the embed and, look at this customer's report. And once I look at that customer's report, I can go to another customer's report. But what we want to look at here is, let's onboard a new tenant. So I'm going to go ahead and let's say that, it is our good friends at Contoso, our customer. And so what I'm going to do here is, make sure we point to the right database. And let's also go back here and kind of remove all this, go ahead, choose OK. And, what we should be able to see is, here is the calls against the Power BI REST API, that do this provisioning process. If you are using the Power BI.NET SDK, which you can, if you're on top of .NET, you have a much easier way to make these calls. If you can't use .NET, then you have to kind of figure out how to make these calls yourself. For instance, here's the call to create a new workspace. After we create the new workspace, we're going to go ahead and import a PBIX file. Note that when you import a PBIX file, the API call is asynchronous. So now what we're going to do is, let's go ahead and kind of look at the JSON that comes back here. Here's the polling. Every couple seconds, we're going to say, what's the import state? Still publishing, still publishing. And then finally, we get down here and we kind of see that, okay, now we're at a import state of succeeded. Also note that it's very easy, when you get that final thing back, to figure out what's the data set, what's the data set ID. Okay, so now that we've done that, well, we update the data set parameters. And once again, the documentation will kind of step you through the code here, but as we look down here and we kind of look at the JSON, I want to update the parameters, so we basically just have a request. We have the correct JSON, inside of the body of the request. And, what do we want to see when it comes back? We want to see that OK, 2000 result. OK. And so, here's all the different steps to go through. I think I've done enough to kind of show you, what's happened, but now we have created this, new particular workspace. And, as I mentioned, let me jump into Power BI for a second. And so one of the things that you could see, is here's the data set or the workspace that just got created. As I come in here and I open it up, it's already pointing, to this customer's database. If I go to other workspaces, they're pointing to other databases, and we've automated the entire process. Finally, if I go to this particular data set down here, and I go, into, no, I clicked on the wrong link. Shame on you. Okay, let's go down to settings. And, one of the things that we can see is, who is the owner? And you can see it's not a user, it's my service principal. Oh, Also, if I look at refresh history, you can kind of see after we've kind of created the workspace and configured it, we have our first successful refresh. So the data set is now populated, with that user's data. Okay, now you've seen that. And one more thing we're going to show is that I can now go over to users. And if I go over the users and we have a particular user, note that we can take that user and we can assign that user to some particular tenant. Okay, let's say at this point, we'll just take that user and leave that user, as unassigned. Okay, so at this point, we now have another break. Let's see if we have any more questions at this time, Daniel.
Still no questions in the chat.
Still no questions. But, that just tells me I'm making everything so clear and so understandable.
Definitely.
That's great feedback. So thank you everyone for that.
Sure.
Let's keep on.
Sure. I just wanted to give a quick plug for the links I put in the chat. So Ted has the 6-part YouTube series that would be found on the Power BI Community Webinars playlist, along with all the other links so far that Ted has pointed out are all in the chat. So yeah, enjoy that and on with the show.
Thank you, sir. Okay, so now we did a quick preview of the AppOwnsDataAdmin application. So now let's flip over and talk about the client side. Now, first of all, it's built as a single page application. And so let's go back here for a second, into Visual Studio. Let me stop this and note that this top application I just showed you is just a regular .NET 5 MVC ASP.NET Core. But now we have this client, and this client is basically just pure HTML, CSS, and TypeScript that gets compiled, into JavaScript. So once again, if I look down here and I look at the one view, you can see that, here is, what we're serving up. So there's really no server-side code, to the client application itself. It's all client-side code, as you would need in an SPA. Now, this client application, has to get its data from somewhere, so it talks to the AppOwnsDataWebApi. Now, one thing to note about this, and I just want to kind of point this out, the documentation, the video series will walk through this, but the client application uses TypeScript and it uses Node.js integration support to provide a much better TypeScript experience as opposed to what comes out of the box with Visual Studio without the Node.js integration. So there are some steps of you must install Node.js, and note that when you build the project, there's also commands built in to make sure that npm install and npm run build run, and the npm run build, is what will take the TypeScript and basically rebuild it, into the JavaScript, which is what is distributed in the client application. Okay, now, when the application comes up, we want to give the user a good experience, and we want to kind of differentiate from the experience of a user that's able to view and a user that has edit capabilities that then we're going to give the ability to kind of move the report into edit mode. Okay. And then also, as I do the demo, this sample also, when we've created the report, and a couple slides ago, I showed you the report template. It has both a regular view for the report and also a mobile view. And there's client-side code that's able to detect the form factor, in which it's rendering, and it's able to kind of seamlessly move back and forth, between the mobile view, and the standard view. And I'll see that, I'll show you that in the demo that's coming up. Now, a couple things about this. Now, when I built this application, I had to build something that worked. Now, one of the things about AppOwnsData is that you want to use Windows and Azure AD, that's great. If you want to use some other platform for your server-side code and some other identity provider, that knows nothing about Microsoft, that's fine. That's the whole point. However, when you create an application, you got to pick one. So I picked Azure AD to create the client application. But what I want to point out is that we've created the solution architecture so that when the client gets authenticated, the API knows the user is authenticated and they know one true fact, what the login ID is. And that would be the same, whether you were building yours with, one login, or ping or Okta or Auth. We have customers that are using all these, and it's not really going to change the overall design because really we log in, we know who the user is, and we return back a view model. And the identity provider that you use between the client and the web API, is really up to you. Now, another thing to see is that what does this API do? So it's going to process the user login. Once the user logs in, we're going to go to the database and find the user profile and update the last logged in event. And if a user profile doesn't exist, we'll just create it on demand. Now, the AppOwnsDataWebApi, also has to talk to the Power BI REST API. And what it needs to do that for is to create embed tokens and other data, for the view model we're going to pass back to the client to do embedding. The API also provides log activity methods so the client can basically make an API call and tell the web API to log some specific activity that's happened. Okay, now what we're going to look at here is that with the design I've created, and this is something that you can do, I would encourage you to think about it, but we're going to use one Azure AD application for both the AppOwnsDataAdmin and the AppOwnsDataWebApi. If you have security requirements that prevent that, that's fine. But what's nice about that is that you don't have to assign any permissions. Since the AppOwnsDataAdmin creates the workspaces, it's automatically an admin. And when we make calls from either application, it will be seen as the same service principal. Once again, just kind of lowering the administrative overhead of managing permissions. Now, once again, here's some details I'm not going to dwell on, but as you go through this and you get the demo up and running, you're going to have to create an Azure AD application for the client. And notice that it only has, one ID. And then another thing that's a little bit strange about Azure AD, or something you might not think about, is that the client application is going to be sending an access token to the web API. And that's what we use to basically tell the web API, this call is coming from a user who, we validated. But an access token has to have at least one permission, or what we call a scope. So as you go through the setup, after you create the application, we're going to create a custom scope. And the idea is that that is the scope or the permission that will be added to the access token that's sent to the API. And the API will basically send back an access denied, if that scope is not inside the access token. Okay, low-level geek stuff. Let's move on. Now, what you're going to see is that this API has a couple things like user login. So the user will log in, and we can update the last updated, login time for the user. We can create a user profile on demand if that's necessary. And what you're going to see is that this application will allow anybody to log in, but it doesn't give anybody access to tenants. So you can create any type of behavior for login that you want, but for this proof of concept, you're going to log in. And if you're not assigned a tenant, we just put up a message saying, thanks for logging in, but until someone, with the right permissions assigns you permissions, you're not going to be able to see anything. And then once the user has permissions, what's going to happen is the web API is going to return back a view model to the client with things that we need for the user interface and to do embedding. And so, calling into the Power BI Service API and creating an embed token and getting that back, is obviously another part. But also, do we need a list of reports so that what are the artifacts that you'd like to embed? Now, what's going to happen in my next demo is I'm going to log in as a user, that has, basically, no permissions, because it's unassigned. And so what I want to do is kind of see the user experience when the user has no assignment to a tenant. And then we'll assign to a tenant with read-only permissions and see what the experience is. And we'll just kind of keep moving, giving the user more permissions as we move on. Okay, now, once again, this is what it's going to look like for the user that is unassigned. And let's go back here. And, let's go and look at our users. And there's this user, Ted Patterson. Great. Let's go back over here. And, now we will log in. And note that, as I log in right here, it goes to the database and sees, hey, this user, doesn't have any permissions. So let's go back now. And so at this point, what I'll do is I'll move just to the, I have the AppOwnsDataAdmin, online. My Visual Studio, instance and this, are both looking at the same database and the same. So I'm going to go here to users. We're going to find that Ted Patterson guy. We're going to go ahead and open it up in edit mode. And now let's first of all, assign that user, to Wingtip Toys. We'll go ahead and choose OK. And now we'll go back here and we'll just refresh. And what you can see is that this user now has been assigned to, this particular tenant. Let's say we did a whoopsie. Oh, we put this user in the wrong tenant. So let's go back here and we'll create not a new user. We'll create a new tenant, and this will be called, Ted Corp. And what we'll do here is, once we've created, this particular new tenant, we'll give it a second because now it's kind of doing the onboarding process, but now, we've created this new Ted Corp. Let's go back to our user, Ted P. Let's go to edit. And now let's assign, this user, to another one. Okay. And now let's see the experience. We go back here, and now I've taken the user, and I put the user and pushed the user kind of to a different environment here. Now, note that for any user, we're going to have the full screen. And so here's just a button. Someone can go to full screen, hit the escape to get out of full screen. Also note, just I'll quickly demo that if I make the browser narrow enough, it basically jumps into the responsive view. Okay, so let's keep going with the demo. And so my next experiment will be, well, I see what it's like when the user has read-only permissions. Let's give this user, edit permissions. So now, once again, we'll go back here and we'll just kind of refresh the client. And now what you'll see, in addition to the full screen button, we have a toggle edit mode. So this would be something like you're doing AppOwnsData embedding, and for certain people, in your customer's tenant, you'd like to give them the permission to come in here and maybe, change it from, one thing to another, maybe change sorting, maybe change colors, and after we've kind of made that change here, let's go ahead and, go ahead and click save, and now we basically made a change. But note that with edit permissions, you have save, but not save as. So this user can customize anything that's there, but can't create anything new. So let's go ahead and add one more permission. So now back here, we'll take this user and we'll add the can create permission as well. Finally, we'll go back here and we'll refresh. So let's say that we have this user, and now this user gets into edit mode. And the first thing that I want to show here is that I now have a save as. And so, maybe we'll have something like, sales in Florida. And then we'll go ahead and once, we've created this new report, what we'd like to do with this report is make some changes. For instance, if I come down here and now we look at customers and let's go ahead and kind of add, Florida as the filter, and now that we've done that, let's go back here, let's go ahead and hit save. And once again, we're kind of empowering the user, so now check out on my mobile device, someone has kind of created this other report that's been customized, and now we can kind of dig in, and see those two as well. Okay. Now, the one extra thing I want to show is that when you give a user create permissions, we're also going to let them create a new report. So for instance, if a user clicks here, now let's say that, we just want something like sales revenue, and with sales revenue, we'll just kind of make some quick, change to our data label. And, now we have, one more new report here. So once again, you have an environment, and we're able to, allow users to kind of start growing out content themselves. Okay, let's go ahead and get back to my slides here. But what we saw, is that to test the user experience, make the browser window narrow, so you can kind of test out, the responsive design with our application, test it to mobile devices. Also, you can kind of see that once you enable edit mode, you kind of give the user editing capabilities. And then also, looks like my animations need a little work here. But, when you give the user the ability to create new content, they can save as reports, which we kind of call a copy report event. And they can create new reports, which is a create report event. Okay, so one more time, we'll circle back to see if we have any questions.
Still no questions in the chat.
Still no questions. Okay.
Please.
What is the meaning of life? 42.
Yeah, there it is.
Okay. So we have one more section. Okay. Should we start giving out prizes for people that ask questions for the end? I think we'll end up about 5 minutes early, so we'll have some time for questions there. Okay, well, now we're into the home stretch. So what we'd like to talk about is adding an element to my custom solution that allows us to monitor user activity, and to look at report performance. So let's kind of start with this idea that as an application works with Power BI, let's go back here for a second. And now what I want to do is let's bring up our good friend Fiddler. And now, with Fiddler open, let's go ahead and do a refresh here. And one of the things that you can see, is that we have, some particular things that are coming inside here. In fact, let's go ahead and copy that URL. And with that URL, okay, you might not be as excited about Fiddler as me, but what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to kind of paste in this URL right here, or this domain, into Fiddler. And now, we'll say run filter set now. So now we can kind of just see the communication here. But what you're going to see is that, as we load the report, it's going to call into the web service. And what is the web service going to do? It's basically going to hand back a view model, that has one or more data sets, one or more reports, so we can build the UI. It also has, things like user can create, user can edit. And note that while the view model, has user can create and user can edit, so you can light up or disable commands in the UI, someone can't attack this, because the embed token, defines whether, the user can really save the report back, whether the user can create something new in the workspace. So this part of the view model, just think of it as the hints to the UI, not to make the user think he or she has options that will fail because they don't have enough permissions. But truly, the embed token is gospel as far as determining what the user can do with that particular report. Okay, now in addition to getting the embed token back, let's look at the activity log. And so the idea is anytime something interesting happens, let's go back over here, you can kind of see we're sending an event, over to the side here. If I just do one more quick demo here, let's go here, let's go ahead and, make one more change. And now we'll come back here and we'll hit save. And we see, there is another event, and this is a view report event. This is an edit report event. So the idea is that we're just kind of taking, information that we want to look at later, and we're pushing it to the web API and putting it in the database. Once we create this table, we're going to be able to use it to monitor the user activity. Now, if you have a bunch of data in a SQL database like we do, can you think of a good way that we could import all that data, maybe model a little bit and create reports from it? Well, of course, So one of the things that you'll see is that when you use the AppOwnsData Starter Kit, and let me throw out one more reference here. If I go back to the AppOwnsData Starter Kit, at the very top level, here is the AppOwnsData Usage Report. So let's move over to this report here. And so here's this report. And what are we bringing back? Things about the user. And then we're going to bring back things in the activity log. Okay, now, this is a report based on import. There's no reason that you couldn't take this report and base it on direct query, to kind of get the ability to kind of see almost instantaneously, what user access is. I've used import mode, so I'll let you decide which one you want to use here. But now we can look at the activity log, and we get to kind of see, who has been in here working with reports, what has been the different types of activity. Do we want to now kind of look, user by user, to kind of see what activity has gone on? Do I want to look at report authoring? Who are the people who have been creating and editing content in our environment? Okay. And then as we get to, one more stage here, we're able to capture the performance of reports. And the way that works is in the client application, we've written this code, which basically, if I kind of go through, the way this code works, at the beginning, before we embed the report, we're just going to get date now, which basically, starts our stopwatch. And then we, call Power BI app.embed. We embed the report, and then we're going to basically handle both the loaded event and the rendered event. Now, the way that this works is loaded will fire exactly one time in the lifetime of that report. Now, render will fire once just after loaded, but then anytime you have a page transition, you move from page 1 to page 2, render fires. Anytime you resize the screen and the report has to adjust to that, render will fire. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're only going to handle the very first firing of render. But what's going to happen is when loaded event happens, we record how much time it took. And then also for the very first render, we do that as well. And then we're able to kind of log this activity event. So if I come back here and we kind of take a look at one of these view reports, what we can see is that we're sending the number of milliseconds it took to load, and then the number of milliseconds it took to render. And generally, longer load times means it takes longer to establish the connection. Long render times might mean that you have too many queries, and once you establish the connection and load was done, it took another 7 or 8 seconds, to basically complete all the queries. So a long load time versus a long render time, means something different. But the idea here is, as we go back and now we can monitor our environment, and we can kind of, look across the different tenants, and we can really kind of monitor things. Maybe we'll look for the, longest render time inside there. And we can have a very proactive way, about seeing some of our customers experiencing, what we think is unacceptable render times, load times, which, might be 5 seconds, 10 seconds, depending on the data. There could be data that's so big, that you'll be more tolerant of longer load times. But once again, this just gives you a proactive way to kind of monitor your environment and start, having a proactive approach, to be able to deal with some of those issues. So we've now kind of got to the end. A couple things I want to talk about before we go into a Q&A session. One is, what are the next steps? So once again, I'll kind of repeat, we didn't provide this as a complete solution. The AppOwnsData Starter Kit, is a seed for you to water and grow. So very intentionally, we have many of the design aspects that are very basic, but we've kind of created them so that you could extend them very easily. So what are the next steps? Well, to get the demo up and going, but maybe then to switch in a different authentication provider, so that you're not using Azure AD, but you're using one of the other authentication providers that are commonly used with AppOwnsData permissions. You might want to create a more granular permission scheme. And, this idea that, should a user be assigned to a tenant and then just have 2 permissions in addition to edit and create? Or do you want to do something, more granular? Can you implement permissions at the report level instead of the tenant level? Absolutely. Is it going to take more work of you adding more tables and adding more code to support that? Absolutely. Another thing to think about is that I talked a lot about security, but I didn't mention row level security. And, I deal with a lot of customers that start approaching AppOwnsData and they start talking about row level security, got to learn it because that's the entire thing. And it's not. Row level security is very important when it comes to a single data set and for you to restrict rows. But row level security doesn't say, which report you can see, which workspace you can see. So there's a lot of value in adding row level security support, but I think there's a lot that you have to do to build an authorization scheme before you even get to considering how to add row level security, into the mix. What I suspect a lot of people will do is to kind of use this architecture and take the AppOwnsData client, which is just written with simple TypeScript and jQuery, and replace it with React and Angular. We see so many of our ISV and enterprise customers, that are doing this on a large scale, and they have an audience where they will spare no expense in developer hours to make sure that audience is happy. And I just see the majority of them, deciding to build their client tier in either Angular or React. And we've created the architecture, with a simple web service API that you can plug in these kind of applications. One last thing is that there's this issue with how many tenants that you can create, or more particularly, how many workspaces that you can create. And so the issue is that any user or any service principal can only be a member of up to 1,000 workspaces. So if you're going to have a very simple approach like I have here, which is basically a single service principal does everything, that will only get to 1,000, before you move into a unsupported territory. So the one last thing I wanted to say is that, while we have the AppOwnsData Starter Kit, there is one more demo that I've done, which is called tenant management. So I would think if AppOwnsData Starter Kit is part 1, the tenant management application is part 2. It talks about when you need to scale over 1,000 workspaces, and therefore you need to either go with a service principal per workspace or to create some kind of pooling scheme. This can give you some guidance for that. Okay, almost done. Last slide here is what are we doing next month? Next month, very exciting. We're going to talk about taking a Power BI report, a single PBIX file, and building it to support multiple languages. So I'm working on a developer sample with a single report that can, be rendered in English or German or French or Spanish or Dutch. And we want to kind of go through the design process. Now, creating multi-language reports, is not for the faint of heart. It requires developer level of knowledge. And so what we'll do is we'll spend the hour, talking about, how we design, with multi-language in mind. We're going to have to discuss things like what's the difference between metadata translations, content translations. We're going to have to talk about taking a PBIX project file and using the tabular editor or using the tabular object model to add translations. And basically, what are all the steps, to get your report to a state where it can just be loaded using different locales and different languages. And certainly that's going to be a major step for lots of companies who have been forced to support multiple languages, but they just take a report and do a save as for French and a save as for German. And obviously that's going to be a lot more overhead. So with that, we've seen a lot of things here today. And I think at this point, we'll just open up and see if there are any more questions.
I don't see any in the chat right now, no.
This is the first talk where we really, ahead of time, talked about we really need to get our act together and handle the questions well. But now we got no questions. Once again, let me thank everybody for your time, for coming and looking at the App Owns Data Starter Kit. Once again, the documentation and the video series is for those that want to dig in. And other than that, best of luck with all your efforts on App Owns Data embedding and getting started with the App Owns Data Starter Kit. Thanks very much.